Hey, I'm golf broadcaster Matt Adams. The updated and expanded second edition of my book, The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, Golf's Biggest Stars Recall Their Finest Moments, is now available. Readers can expect to march with Arnie's Army at the 1960 U.S. Open, relive Jack Nicklaus's remarkable 1986 Masters win, and be amazed by the Tiger Slam. The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, Golf's Biggest Stars Recall Their Finest Moments. Pick it up where fine books are sold, including BarnesandNoble.com and Amazon.com.
Hello, old sports, and welcome to another episode of the Hello Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. I'm Dan Newman. I was playing cards with some old coworkers this past Friday, and one of them told me that, well, he listens to the podcast. He tries to speed it up because he says I talk way too slow. So, Jared, I'll try and talk a little faster just for you so that whenever you get to this episode, I can you don't have to play it at 1.5 speed. So, but either way, thank you for listening. I'm Dan Newman. We are ready to travel back in time 40 years for the second episode in a row. We'll get to that in a minute. But I am joined by my brother, my co-host, Andrew Newman. And Andrew, how are you doing?
I am excellent, Dan. I am about 2 days into a 2-week vacation. My California baseball stadium trip begins this coming Saturday out in Oakland and San Francisco. And I was supposed to be working Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday this week, and then the company was going to be closed Thursday, Friday. And they told us, you know what, we're far enough ahead, we're in good enough shape to take the whole week. So we're recording this on the Tuesday. I'm freshly beat red from a nice hike today in Beacon, New York. Freshly rested from a nice 3-hour nap. And I am ready to talk about the 1984 World Series.
So, well, not just the World Series. We're going to talk about a lot of things from sports in 1984.
Crap. Okay.
No. For those of you who may not be longtime listeners, that actually happened in an episode, but it happened the good way about 2 years ago. We were all set to talk about an episode that I had said was just going to be about the 1947 World Series, but Andrew had prepared for all sorts of things for 1947. So every once in a while, he jokes that he doesn't know exactly what we're going to be talking about. Luckily, in that instance, he was over-prepared rather than under-prepared. So, but this time, it's last time we did. Really, I think that the lion's share of the episode last time was basketball, college basketball, pro basketball, Olympic basketball, and then we did the rest of the Olympics. We did hockey, and then we talked about the world of pro wrestling, as we are known to do in these episodes. So tonight it's baseball, it's football, and it's kind of a little bit of everything else.
Yeah, we did sort of the sports that ended before the midway point of the year, or really anything that took place before, the summer was over, and just have to rewind just a little bit to talk about baseball and then end up where we always do with college football and eventually the NFL.
So I guess we start with baseball, and there's really, I don't know how much excitement there is in baseball, particularly in the American League. This is the famous Detroit Tiger teams that wins 35. They win their first 9 games of the season. They win 35 of their first 40 games. They start off at 35-5. They are never not in first place. In fact, I think I don't own this book, but I think there's a book about this team that's called Wire to Wire, or something like that. And I don't know if it's, I think that, well, obviously if they win their first 9, they're undefeated for the first 9 games. Nobody else is. And for the first 9 games, they never have less than 1,000 winning percentage. So they literally, obviously early on in the season, there are other teams that are 1-0, 2-0, 3-0, but they literally are never out of first place a single game in the entirety of the 1984 season.
And this is sort of your example, because I was just as you were talking, kind of going, how did this build up? Because I honestly have no idea. And the early 80s are kind of a famous time where there was so much. It was like a different 2 teams in the World Series every year, where it was like, even if you start in 80 and it was the Phillies and the Royals. Then 81 was Dodgers Yankees. 82 was Cardinals Brewers. 83 was Orioles Phillies. So one repeat there. And then you're at 84 with the Tigers and the team they're going to play. We talk about. So I was looking, and in 81 they and 81 was that weird split season, but they finished fourth in both halves of the 81 season. Then in 82 in the AL Central, or excuse me, in the AL East rather, they go 83 and 79, so they're still fourth. They're 12 games back of Milwaukee that ultimately won it. And then by 83, they're a second place team. They're 92 and 70, but they are still 6 games behind the Orioles who won the World Series that year, and I believe went wire to wire in their own rights. So, maybe not a team that was seen as, not an out of nowhere team, but certainly a team that the build was very, slow and direct.
Their best player on offense is the Hall of Fame shortstop Alan Trammell, who hits 314. He's the only player on the Tigers who has a 300 average. And these are in the days. This is sort of just as guys like Trammell and Cal Ripken are starting to come into Major League Baseball. And so the idea of sort of, other than Ernie Banks, maybe the idea of this sort of offensive firepower as a shortstop is something that's still relatively new. Trammell, in addition to leading the team in batting, he also wins a Gold Glove, one of a number of Gold Gloves that he would win in his career. Lou Whitaker, who's the Trammell's double play partner, is a guy who a lot of people still think belongs in the Hall of Fame, and he's kind of failed to get in. That their leading home run hitter is actually the catcher Lance Parrish. And then they also have Kirk Gibson, who at 27 years of age hits 282 with 27 home runs and 91 RBIs. He's second on the team in both home runs and RBIs. Everybody really sort of associates Kirk Gibson with the Dodger home run off of Eckersley in 1988, and that's understandably so, but he played the first 9 seasons of his career with Detroit. He was a native of Pontiac, Michigan, and had attended Michigan State University. So Gibson was a Michigan guy, a Detroit area guy through and through. So this hometown guy, one of the main leaders of the Detroit Tigers in the 84 season, before going on to later things with the Dodgers that everybody knows him for so well.
Yeah, and interestingly had a sort of famous moment in famous moment in this World Series too, that just gets overshadowed by 4 years later the fact that he had probably one of the most famous baseball moments, certainly in the TV era, but probably of all time with the Dodgers, so that the 84 one almost gets, I'm sure not in Detroit and probably not in San Diego, but sort of nationally, it's like you don't have room for 2 moments. You get one. I think he gets the 88 one.
The manager is the Hall of Famer Sparky Anderson, who becomes the first manager, and I think to date the only manager to win a World Series in both leagues. I'm trying to think. I know Bucky Harris had won it with 2 teams with the
La Russa.
Okay, so La Russa does it later, though. La Russa does it later.
Oh, I thought you meant still to this day.
No, well, I was trying to think if anybody else had done it, but you're right. Yeah, La Russa's the other one. I think those might be the only 2. Not another one doesn't immediately come. Well, Bochy's done it now for just this past year, but it's a relatively rare thing. Guys have brought teams in both leagues. Dusty Baker brought teams into both leagues. Dick Williams, actually, who we're going to talk about in a couple minutes here, had brought teams in both leagues. But Anderson, who had been with the Reds as the manager of the Big Red Machine through the late 70s, is now in Detroit. He leads the team. The ace is another Hall of Famer in Jack Morris, who is 19 and 11. But perhaps the best pitcher that year for the Tigers is the closer, And that's Willie Hernandez, the closer out of Aguada, Puerto Rico, who in 1984 finishes first not only in the Cy Young Award voting, but also in the MVP award. I don't know. He's not the last guy to do that. He's one. Eckersley might have done it in the early '90s, but
I think Kershaw did it too, not as a reliever, but
not as a reliever. Okay, yeah, you're okay. Yeah, no, so other guys have done it. Yeah, I think I meant other relievers. Yeah, because Kershaw did it and Verlander did it one year. But yeah, a reliever to win both, and this was a really weird period when relief pitchers were winning not only a decent number of Cy Young awards, but also a decent number of MVP awards as well. And that's Willie Hernandez, who actually just passed away last year, and we covered him on our in memoriam. And so he is a guy who does not necessarily have a particularly spectacular career, but this year he's good enough to win not only the Cy Young Award, but also the American League MVP.
Yeah, he'd been on the Cubs since breaking in '77 through '83. Traded, halfway through, or I guess a little less than halfway through the '83 season. Finishes that season with the Phillies, and then he's on to Detroit this is his '84 is his first year with Detroit. Yeah, before this, he had how many his best season before '84 in terms of saves was 10 in 1982. Before that, he had only had 4, 3, 0, 0, 2, and then 8, and then he jumps up to 32 in 1984. ERA is a full run lower than it's ever been at 1.92, and he's the closer on this team that, like you referenced, goes wire to wire. And if he's closing, it says he finished 68 games. So, a little less than half of their games. And while that's a lot of opportunities to pitch with a lead late in the game and get saves, it's also one of the ways you lead wire to wire and don't get seriously challenged the whole year is to not give games away in the 8th and 9th innings.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot more of interest, I think, in the National League this year. The Tigers, they sweep the Kansas City Royals in the ALCS. They blow them out in game 1. They actually win it in 11 in game 2. But a bases a double, 2-run double by a guy by the name of Johnny Grubb hits a double off of Dan Quisenberry, who's a damn good closer in his own right, to win that game 5-3, and then they actually win a pitcher's duel in game 3 back in Detroit when Charlie Leibrandt, pitching for Kansas City, allows only 1 run and 3 hits. But that one run in the bottom of the second inning is good enough for a 3-0 sweep for the Tigers. So they really don't face much opposition at all in the regular season or the playoffs. They have a couple of close games in the LCS, but a sweep in the LCS, regardless of what the scores are, is, in my mind, pretty dominant.
Yeah, and I guess this would be the last year, I want to say, of the best 3 out of 5 LCSs, because I know by 86 and we've had this discussion before, but I know by 86 it's a 7-game series. I can't remember with 85, but I want to say those might have been best 5 out of 7 as well, or best 4 out of 7.
I think the last time we talked about this, we looked and it said that 85 was 7 games. So that
85 was 7 because the Royals and the Blue Jays played a 7-game series. So this was the last year of the 3 out of 5 series.
And incidentally, I'm just reading here that if game 5 of the ALCS, if it had gone to 5 games, it would have been played at 1:00 in the afternoon, so as not to interfere with viewership of the Reagan-Mondale debate. So
that's come up a lot lately. Anyway, let's move along. So National League, do you want to start with the team that wins the National League? Is the what else, anywhere else you'd rather go to start?
I think we probably want to start with the team that loses the NLCS because this is a really good year, and I guess sort of an unexpectedly good year for Ryne Sandberg and the Chicago Cubs. The Cubs, who famously had a lot more bad seasons than good, but in '84 they have a really good season. They sort of going into this, the Cubs had they'd been bad. They hadn't had a winning season since 1977, and then before that, it was 72, and then they were decent in the Ernie Banks years, but they really hadn't had a great. But in '84, they have a team that almost makes it to the World Series. Ryne Sandberg is MVP. They trade early in the season for or not even really early in the season, sort of like mid-season. They trade with the Cleveland Indians. They trade away for a pitcher named Rick Sutcliffe, who goes 16-1 with the Cubs and wins the Cy Young Award, wins the NL Cy Young Award despite not even pitching in the National League the whole season, and leads the Cubs to the the NL East title within a game of the World Series. And the two guys that he's traded for, both names you might have heard of. Rick Sutcliffe is traded from the Cleveland Indians to the Cubs, and Cleveland in return gets Mel Hall and Joe Carter, two guys who would go on to do noteworthy things in the 1990s. One hit a game.
A way to put that's one way to put it.
One hit a game-winning home run in the World Series, and another is currently serving 40 years in prison or whatever it is for having an inappropriate relationship with a teenager. So that's Sutcliffe. But really, for the Cubs, this is Sandberg's year.
Hang on, let's clear that up right there, because you said having an inappropriate relationship with an underage girl. And you said, so that's Sutcliffe. That was Mel Hall, just to sort of cap that again. We were moving on from the Sutcliffe trades.
Yes, exactly.
Let's just be clear about that. But go ahead. Sorry.
And I'd also note that the Cubs manager wins Manager of the Year that year as well. His name is Fry, Frey. I'm trying to get his first name here. Jim Fry. And then there's
Dallas Green was the GM of that team, right?
Dallas Green was the GM of the team. Yeah. I want to there's this famous game called the Sandberg game in June of 1984. It's on NBC's baseball game of the week, which is really a big thing on Saturdays in the 1980s. It was Bob Costas was the lead broadcaster, play-by-play, and then Tony Kubek, not only great broadcaster, but a guy who'd been an all-star shortstop for the Yankees in the 60s. And it's this game where the Cubs win 12-11. Sandberg, the Cubs had deficits of 7-1, 9-3, and 11-9. Ryne Sandberg hits 2 game-tying home runs after a former Cub, who actually, like Willie Hernandez, had been a reliever that won. I believe, did Suter win an MVP or just I know he just won a Cy Young, Suter. But anyway, he had been a Cy Young award-winning reliever with the Cubs. He's now with the Cardinals. Suter, who's in the Hall of Fame. So this is known as the Sandberg game because Sandberg gets 2 game-tying home runs to lead the Cubs to a 12-11 victory in 11 innings over their arch rivals, the St. Louis Cardinals. And everybody really sort of thinks on the heels of these great regular season victories. They also have Dennis Eckersley is on this team too for the Cubs. He was actually, that's right. Do you know who Eckersley had been with Boston? Speaking of crazy trades, do you know
the Buckner trade?
Yeah, Eckersley in '84 gets traded from the Red Sox to the Cubs for Bill Buckner. So they've got first of all, they got some damn good mustaches on this team between Eckersley and Rick Sutcliffe. but they've got a Cy Young Award winner, and then they've got a future Hall of Famer in Dennis Eckersley, who I believe Eckersley at this point, I think Eckersley I believe is still a starter at this point in 84.
I'll see what I can find real quick.
He's still a starter in 84. So
looks like 86 is his last year as a starter.
Yeah, he kind of does it. It's La Russa, the aforementioned Tony La Russa, who kind of turns Dennis Eckersley into a closer a couple years later, and gets him to the Hall of Fame in the process, because he was a good player, Eckersley, but he was certainly not a Hall of Fame pitcher as a starter. So these 84 Cubs, everybody thinks they're sort of the team of destiny. They got the MVP, they got the Cy Young Award winner, they got Manager of the Year, but it kind of, as it often does, it kind of ends in heartbreaking fashion for them as they lose the NL Championship, NLCS, to another sort of surprising team, and that's the San Diego Padres. So maybe we should talk a little bit about them.
Yeah, and the Padres, I have an article here from thisgreatgame.com, and it's just kind of the 84 season in like narrative form, and it just sort of sets the background. It says the Padres entered 1984 with 15 years of existence, only one of which had resulted in a winning record. They had a lot of guys who played elsewhere on postseason teams: Steve Garvey, Greg Nettles, Goose Gossage, a young Tony Gwynn on the team, and a manager in Dick Williams, who had been the manager of the A's in the early 70s and the first two A's championship teams in 72 and 73.
And he also, before that, had been the manager of the Impossible Dream Red Sox in 67 with Yastrzemski.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So a guy who's got a lot of pelts on his horse.
Tony Gwynn, in what's his first full season, he's not he's got too many at bats. He played in 54 games in 82 and 86 games in 83, but 158 games in 84 at 24 years of age. This is his first full season as a pro. Leads all of baseball with 213 hits, leads all of baseball with a 351 batting average. This is the first of I think it's 8 batting titles for Tony Gwynn. And it's funny too, because if you look at I don't know about you, but I remember Tony Gwynn as like the mid and late 90s Tony Gwynn, the guy who played against the Yankees in the 98 World Series, who was kind of like a bald, chubby guy. If you look at Tony Gwynn from 1984, he's got like a Jerry curl almost. He's got a mustache. He's a lot thinner. Guy was a decent base runner early on in his career. In fact, Tony Gwynn this same year has 33 stolen bases. A couple of years later, he'd have 56 stolen bases. 1989, Tony Gwynn has 40 stolen bases. And he'd had previous years of 56, 26, 37, 33. And then starting in 90, his steals kind of fall off a cliff. He never steals more than 17 bases in a game, or in a season, I should say, ever again. But he was a Gold Glove winner every year. I think that for those of us who kind of grew up on the East Coast, and it sometimes gets lost in the shuffle just how great a hitter Tony Gwynn was.
Yeah, and by the way, just to sort of talk about what you were saying, I always, as a kid, just assumed Tony Gwynn was a power hitter because he was kind of chubby, or at least proportioned like that. I was like, oh, he's a home run hitter, because that's what home run, you think of like Mo Vaughn, and then not Tony Gwynn was never the size of Mo Vaughn, but like, oh, well, he's a home run hitter. Even though the most home runs he ever hit in his career was 17 in 1997, and he only broke 10 3 times. But yeah, Gwynn is one of those where he, not only did he play on the West Coast, he played on, minus basically this year and then one towards the very end of his career, mostly bad teams, or, maybe mostly average teams, but certainly not teams that were making postseason runs and on national TV all the time. And the 80s and 90s from a media landscape, it certainly wasn't the 40s and 50s where, well, you can read about them in the newspaper 3 weeks later, but like you wouldn't, if Tony Gwynn, especially, maybe this was different as an adult, but I don't think it was that different. If Tony Gwynn did something at 11:30 at night in the Padres versus the I keep thinking of the Giants versus the Padres. I kept almost saying AL teams.
Yeah.
In the Giants Padres game in San Diego on a Tuesday night, it's like not only were you not going to see that till tomorrow morning, if you didn't see, like you probably weren't going to see it. And the numbers you wouldn't, especially with us being not only East Coast people but American League fans. We rooted for the Yankees in the American League. The Padres were one of the most like off my radar teams as a kid.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, because they weren't very good and they were far away and all that type of thing. And Gwynn was never a guy who he was never like a Griffey or one of these guys who was going to transcend it all with the marketing and the highlights. He was just, but I mean, I don't know how many not a lot of guys have won 7 batting titles. So and he won 8, so especially not a lot of guys have won 8 batting titles. So yeah, he is one of the all-time greats, great offensive, and really just one of the all-time great players in Major League history. And this 84 season, like we said, is his first really good season, or first full season, I should say, as a pro, and it's enough to lead the Padres to the NLCS in the 1984 season, where the Cubs suffer a very heartbreaking loss, you would say.
Yeah, and this is still, like we said, it's still a 5-game series, so it's a first 2 games in one site, next 3 games in another site, right? I believe that's still correct.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and we should also note that in addition to some of the other Hall of Famers, the Cubs also have another Hall of Fame relief pitcher, Hall of Fame in Lee Smith is their closer. So they don't even need Eckersley to close games because they got Lee Smith. So really good team.
So just a couple of things. This is the first year, I just saw this as kind of an interesting aside. It's the first year that the AL and NLCSs are only on national TV. I guess up until that year, broadcast TV outlets were allowed to also cover the game, kind of like you see now with the first round of the NBA playoffs or the NHL too. They can cover those games on MSN or on MSNBC, on MSG. But once the Knicks got to the second round, they were just national. So the first couple of games are at Wrigley Field. And correct me if I'm wrong. If you don't know this, it's fine. It's not really germane to this, but I feel like stories I've read about the Cubs finally getting night games in 1988, finally installing lights and playing a night game. I feel like I remember something from this season where Major League Baseball was like threatened them, but then backed off on, if you make the World Series, you have to play in Comiskey because we're not going to play World Series games in the middle of the day. Obviously, it became a moot point, but I feel like they made the threat and then kind of said like, well, okay, this year is fine, but in the future, we're not going to back off or something like that. Does that ring any bells at all?
Yeah, that sounds very familiar to me. I don't see anything about it right in front of me either, but I'm 97% sure that's the same thing. I'm trying to see if this 1984 book that I have here, this book by John Wertheim, this Glory Days that I've been citing from so heavily in these episodes, if that has anything about it, but I don't. I don't see
While you
it.
do that, let me just go through the first couple of games. So game 2, October 2nd, 84, Tuesday.
Do you want to start with game 1, or are you just going to go right into game 2?
Game 1 on Tuesday is what I meant. Much more benign than my confusing phrasing of something was much more benign than before when you indicated somebody was a sex pest. The wrong person. So game 1 on Tuesday. Look, it was Tuesday, October 2nd. So that was where the mistake came in. Wrigley Field in Chicago. The Cubs destroy San Diego 13-0. It's 5-0 after 3. The Cubs get 6 runs in the 5th inning. They Rick Sutcliffe, Bob Dernier, do you know how to pronounce that? Is it Dernier or
I think
Dernier?
it's probably Dernier.
Dernier and Gary Matthews hit home runs in the first off Eric Snow. Then Rick Sutcliffe also homered in the third.
Jeez.
So all Cubs, Sutcliffe gets the win, 13-0. Game two is the next day. The Cubs get out to a 3-0 lead. They end up winning 4-2. They take a 2-0 lead in the series, and they head to San Diego after a day, or actually no day off. Geez, they go right to San Diego and play. So they're up 2-0, and they just have to win one of three in Southern California to go to their first World Series in 39 years.
And in game three, the Cubs take a 1-0 lead, but then the Padres smack Dennis Eckersley around, and they end up pulling away to win that game 7-1. And so the home field has sort of held serve, and then I guess, is there an off day here? I think there might be an off day here. Yes, though. So there is an off
Well,
day.
it's not because of rain.
Why is that?
It doesn't really rain in San Diego to any significant extent.
That's a good point.
This is extremely my thing here. Jack Murphy Stadium played Cub Busters, a parody of the theme song from the 1984 movie Ghostbusters, which probably did not throw one of its famous Cub fan stars of that movie.
Bill Murray, yeah.
Cub Busters t-shirts inspired from the movie were popular attire for Padres fans. Prior to the game, fans in the parking lot were hanging teddy bears and singing "We Ain't Afraid of No Cubs." So they're normally reserved. What you picture is sort of the laid-back Southern California fans. I guess not as much the case here. Game four was the follow. Was Saturday, 2 days later. This one is a little more dramatic, where the Padres end up winning 7-5. They're up 2-0 early. Then it's a 3-3 tie. San Diego gets two in the bottom of the seventh so they tie the game in the fifth on an RBI single from Garvey. Then Garvey has another single to give the Padres the lead, and then there's a pass ball, which makes it 5-3. In the eighth, the Cubs get runs after Sandberg singles, steals second, scores on an RBI single, and then Henry Cotto, a pinch runner, scores on an RBI double to tie the game. Lee Smith comes in the bottom of the ninth. Gwynn hits a single to start the rally with one out. Garvey has launches a 2-run home run to complete a 5 RBI day. It just gets past Cotto's glove, and the Padres have now come all the way back and tied this series at 2 games apiece.
And then game five is its own set of dramas here. The Cubs score 2 runs in the top of the first. They score a run in the top of the second to make the score 3-0. But then things started to go not so great after that. And before the game, Ryan Sandberg had been getting some Gatorade, and he accidentally knocked over the Gatorade onto the glove of the first baseman, Leon Durham. And the glove is soaked with Gatorade. They try everything. They try and wipe it up with towels. They try and use a hair dryer. And the game is when the game begins, the ball is the glove rather is still very sticky. The Durham actually asks the Cubs third base coach, a guy by the name of Don Zimmer, if Zimmer thinks that he should still use the glove. Zimmer says, "Hey, it might bring you luck." In the seventh inning, with the Cubs ahead 3-2, San Diego batter named Tim Flannery hits a ground ball, and it's likely a double play ball, and the ball scoots through squirts through Durham's legs and into the outfield. The Padres go on to score 4 runs in that inning. They make it 6-3. They would have been out of the game. They most likely would have been out of the game, out of the inning, if Durham had made that play on the double play ball. And I don't know if this is before this game or this is just around this time, but the former Cubs broadcaster Jack Brickhouse says, "Hey, everyone's entitled to a bad century," referring to the Cubs. So the Cubs, there's still another 32 years before they would win their World Series, and there's some more heartbreak to come. Whether it's the Bartman game in 2003 or they lost it the playoffs in '89 to San Francisco. So there's more Cubs postseason heartbreak to come, but this certainly belongs on that list as a devastating loss. Not just that they lost it on an error by a usually sure-handed fielder, but also the fact that they had been up 2-0 in the series and still lost it in 5.
The years you always hear about with the Cubs curse thing, post 45, because most of the people talking about it, you hear about they won in the early 20th century, and then they got to a few World Series and lost to the Yankees a few times, to the Tigers at least once in 1945. The 3 years you hear about sort of after that they most focus in on are 1969, when they had a really, really good team and the Mets caught fire and just zoomed past them, 1984 and 2003. So if you kind of think of those, they're roughly every 15 years or so. I guess 84 to 03 is closer to 20. So each generation kind of gets their own either game or moment to have as sort of their own heartbreaking moment. Now, I think if you're really unfortunate, if you were a certain age in 03, you got all of them. And they kept getting progressively worse if you look at it.
Uh-huh.
But Jeff Garland, there was an ESPN, or not ESPN, HBO did a good special a few years ago on the Cubs. I say a few years ago, it had to be pushing 20 years ago at this point. It was at least 15 because it was after Bartman. They did a thing on the Cubs. It's called Wait Till Next Year, and it followed people around and stuff. And it was interspersed with people going to an opening day, but also talking about the history of the Cubs. And Jeff Garland, the guy from Curb Your Enthusiasm, he was a big Cubs fan from Chicago, and he was talking about this game, and he said something along the lines of it made it worse that it was the Padres, because it was Yankee fans Red Sox fans get to have the Yankees as their tormentor, and usually it's the Cardinals that are our tormentor. He's and now we get the freaking San Diego Padres out there doing this to us, and it's sort of how I felt in 01 with the Yankees and the Diamondbacks, and 03 with the Yankees and the Marlins. The difference being the Yankees had won 4 world championships immediately preceding that.
Yeah, exactly.
But so that's an interesting perspective on it as well. And I think what makes this probably the one angle of that's maybe worse than 80, it's worse than 03, is in 84, if it gives them any comfort, they wouldn't have beaten the Tigers either.
Yeah, and that's probably true. And we don't necessarily have to spend a ton of time on it. The Tigers win the close enough games. They win game 1, 3-2 in San Diego, behind a strong pitching performance from Jack Morris. Incidentally, Jack Morris, who would go on to also have strong World Series performances with the Twins in 91 and the Blue Jays in 92. Morris wins World Series with 3 different American League teams in the course of 8 years. They do lose game 2 to the Padres, 5-3 in San Diego. Winning pitcher in that game is none other than Andy Hawkins, who would later go on to lose a 4-0 game with the Yankees, despite pitching a no-hitter. And we talked about that game a little bit a couple episodes on our last Comiskey interview episode. I don't know. Tigers win game 3, Tigers win game 4. To me, the only real sort of memorable moment in here is in game 5. But did you have anything else before game 5 that was particularly noteworthy?
No, not particularly. Honestly, it was just the series that involved the Tigers in this postseason were the ones that really didn't have any drama, just because of how damn good the Tigers are.
Yeah. So in the bottom of the eighth, so I guess the Tigers are still winning this game. This Gossage home run seems to like really sort of really this Gibson home run off Gossage, which is considered a memorable home run. You talked about how that's Gibson's American League moment, and obviously 4 years later is his National League moment. But in reality, so what happens is there's two runners on, there's one out, first base is open. Dick Williams comes out to talk to Goose Gossage and thinks he's going to order Gossage to walk Gibson. Gossage talks Williams into letting him pitch to Gibson. Gibson instead hits a 3-run home run to make it 8-4. That home run has taken on a lot of lore, I think, because it would have made sense to for Gossage to walk Gibson, and because Gibson, like we said, ended up going on and hitting another big home run in World Series play. Plus, Gossage was a Hall of Famer, but the Padres are still down a run, down to their last 3 outs against a closer in Willie Hernandez, who was good enough to be not only the Cy Young Award winner, but the MVP. So I'd never really thought about it before, but part of me kind of feels like that Kirk, and also they were up 3-1 anyway. So in the series, so I don't know, maybe that Gibson home run's a little bit overrated, I guess I would have to say.
Yeah, I don't think I blame you, or I don't think I disagree there. It's to an extent sort of like Reggie Jackson's third home run in 77. They were well on their way to winning that game, whether he hit a third home run or not. It's just part of the lore. You know what I mean? I would think for most Tiger fans, the reason that moment's so special to them is, okay, now we don't have to live and die through this inning. Like, I don't think anybody was probably saying we won, it's over at that point, but it's sort of like that, well, that ought to do it. You know what I mean? So it's the last moment of sort of triumph of, okay, now we're comfortably ahead and just get these 3 outs. And who cares if 2 guys hit home runs? Just get these 3 outs instead of when you're up 1 in that situation. Crap, they get a single and suddenly the winning run is at the plate.
So I don't know if there's anything else that really bears out mentioning too much from baseball. The Cubs and the Tigers kind of sweep all of the major awards. The Cubs and the Tigers have MVP, Manager of the Year, and Cy Young are all from either the Cubs or the Tigers in the 2 leagues. I guess just to maybe go at it from a New York point of view real quick, Doc Gooden is Rookie of the Year and is second in Cy Young voting to Sutcliffe. He comes up at 19 years of age and has a 17-9 record, leads all of the majors with 276 strikeouts, which is actually the most strikeouts Gooden will ever have in his entire career. Mets are just starting to become what they would be. This is Davey Johnson's first year as manager. They'd been 68 and 94 the year before. They go 22 games better this year with 90 wins. I think this is Keith Hernandez's first year on the team. No, he'd been traded midseason in 83. So, Strawberry had been a rookie the year before. So Hernandez, Strawberry, Gooden, Ron Darling. You're starting to see sort of the guys who would be the real nucleus of the championship team 2 years later join the Mets. And then Gooden is obviously the most prominent of those in 84.
And it's hard to overstate just how the starts for him in 84 were an event. And the Mets had a similar thing, maybe about, I forget which specific year, but there was a year where when Matt Harvey was pitching, it was like an event. It was the WFAN would be talking about how it's Harvey Day. Now, there's a part of me that thinks they were forcing that a little because of Gooden in 84 to make it on a level with that, but he still was living up to that.
We got a little bit of that in DC once upon a time with Strasburg too.
And I was actually, when I was living in DC and Strasburg first came up, the first 6 starts he made, it was like people in the city, the yuppie company I worked for, where most people didn't, they knew that Strasburg was pitching that day. Like it was a big deal. I remember I was at a happy hour. This was like I was almost gone. I had already given my notice and I was at like a work happy hour. And like the bosses were, oh, we're all going out to a bar after this. Like, well, we'll pay, whatever. And you would come up and somehow we got a ticket. It was like his third or fourth start. And I told one of the bosses, I'm like, I got to go. I got Nats tickets. And they're like, you're going to leave here to go to a Nats game? And I was like, yeah, but Strasburg's pitching. And they were like, oh, yeah, okay, go. Like, no, I mean, I could have gone it. I could have gone anyway. Nobody was stopping me from going. But like, they were like, okay, now I understand it. So it was similar to that. But Gooden also pitched for the whole year. The years we're talking about, or especially with Strasburg, he came up in the middle of the year. So Gooden was, really a phenom. And in a lot of ways with him, maybe 85 as well, you could group in there. It's never quite that good again because you start to hear about his extracurriculars and he struggles a little. And, obviously they would win in 86 and he was a big part of that team. But by then, and nobody would have thought it at the time, his sort of high watermark had already been achieved.
Yeah, 85 was the year he was just on conscience. 24-4, 1.53 ERA, 16 complete games. He should have been the MVP in 85. His WAR for 85 was 13.3. And the three guys in front of him that year, Willie McGee, Dave Parker, and Pedro Guerrero. Willie McGee and Dave Parker combined have a WAR of 12.9, and Gooden's is more than that. It's just one guy and a pitcher to boot. So 85 is the year where Gooden is just absolutely amazing. It's actually, strangely, the only year Gooden ever wins 20 games is 1985. So that's the year that's like one of the all-time great years for him. One of the all-time great years in single season years in pitching history. But yeah, 84 is where it really all starts. And then the Yankees they're decent. This is one of our most recent episodes was about all the Billy Martin years, the firings and everything. This is actually a little bit of a down year for the Yankees. In 83 they were 91 win team. In 84 they were down to 87, and then in 85 they went back up to 97. This is, like I said, this is Yogi Berra's only full year as Yankee manager, and in this go round, he had been in 64. Obviously, Don Mattingly, I believe, is a batting. Yeah, this is one of Mattingly's best years as a pro. Wins a batting title with a 343 average. It sort of like Gooden. You don't realize in retrospect because of how his career ended, just how good Mattingly was in these years. 343, 324, 352, 327, home run numbers in the 30s. Following year, he's got 145 RBIs. So, Mattingly and Gooden, sort of the two great New York baseball heroes of the 80s, both starting to come into their own in 1984.
Do you have anything else on the baseball season, or should we move on?
No, it's not a super memorable season. There's not a pennant race really. The biggest story is obviously that NLCS, but there's not, nobody really breaks any records, even like Rick Sutcliffe has this amazing 16 in 1 year, but it's a little bit been lost to history. There's, whether it's 86 or 88 or, even 89 with the earthquake, 85 with Don Denkinger. There are other years in baseball in and around this season that seem to have bigger stories, but what it does feature is one of the great single season teams of all time in the 84 Tigers.
Agreed.
So we always close with football, but first we get into some other stuff. Really, the big one to me this year is tennis, but I don't know. Do you maybe want to run through some other sort of random things? Keeping in mind, of course, that we and this is not for you, but for the listenership, that we did the Olympics last episode. So if you're looking for the Olympics, check out episode the first half of this two-parter.
Yeah. So I'll just run through. I'll skip over tennis, and we'll come back to that. 84 Indianapolis 500 was won by Rick Mears, it was his second win. He had also won in 79. He would go on to win two more. He does I believe he's ahead by 2 laps pretty much the whole time. So not a super interesting or exciting one, or one that bears a ton of conversation. The Daytona 500, I figured I'd add that one in. That was won by Cale Yarborough, who won the second year in a row, and for the fourth time in his career. It was the year before he had passed on the final lap to win it. This year he does the same thing over Darrell Waltrip. The overall Winston Cup winner in NASCAR was Terry Labonte. In horse racing, and this is kind of interesting, it's something you would never see in this day and age. A horse, and I don't know how to pronounce it, so we'll just go with the way it's spelled. Swale, Swale, wins the Kentucky Derby, falls to 7th in the Preakness. Gate Dancer wins the Preakness, and then Swale comes back and wins the Belmont Stakes. So wins both ends of it, but loses in the middle, and not just loses, but falls all the way down to 7th. And the reason I said this isn't the kind of thing you would see these days is if a horse, first of all, none of them run all three. Like the Belmont, if a horse wins the Kentucky Derby and doesn't win the Preakness, half the time that horse doesn't even run in the Belmont.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say.
I think this year in the Belmont, none of the horses had run both other races. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if any of the horses in the Preakness outside of the winner had run the Belmont. And I will say this, and then we'll move on because it's not the subject of what we're talking about now. I think they should consider spreading those out more so they can get more of the horses to run at all three of them again. Because horses like that don't run that frequently.
Yeah.
I think they should probably spread them out every 6 months, or not 6 months, every like 5 to 6 weeks instead of 2 weeks and then 3 weeks. But we'll move on from that. So nothing super interesting from horse racing.
Real quick, just to go back to auto racing, the one thing that happens this year that I had sort of noted was that the Richard Petty, the great Richard Petty, one of the greatest drivers in NASCAR history, wins his 200th race at something called the Firecracker 400, and I don't know. I don't think it is. It looks like it's actually something that's at Daytona, which is. Yep, it's at Daytona Beach, Florida. So I guess it's we're not racing experts by any stretch of the imagination, but I guess it's at the same place that they hold the Daytona 500. But Richard Petty wins his 200th race actually on Independence Day, July 4th, 1984, and this is attended by a number of a large crowd that includes President Reagan, and Reagan is the first sitting U.S. president to attend a NASCAR race, and he sees Richard Petty win his 200th race. So that was just something else that I found from the world of autocar racing.
And Reagan, he had engine trouble on the 48th lap, I believe, and his car had to withdraw from the race. You said he was sitting. I figured you meant he was like sitting in the car. So moving along, boxing, for when it is in the middle of this 80s period.
There's like nothing there.
Well, it's also annoying because anytime you try to Google 1984 boxing, all you get is Olympic boxing.
Mm-hmm.
So the heavyweight title, I'll tell you right now, there's nothing significant. We're in the era of a fragmented heavyweight championship. Some of the names I have are Jerry Cortez, Tim Whitney. It's a very fractured time. Really, the after Holmes and before Tyson starts reunifying the titles is a very bad time in heavyweight boxing. And for people who think, the titles were, the fragmenting of the titles was a more modern phenomenon. Certainly it was worse in the modern era. And, usually back in the older times, things would get reconciled a lot more quickly. But this was a time when there was no real distinguished heavyweight champion to speak of. It wouldn't be till 86 when Tyson started winning every one of them and unifying them again.
Yeah.
the big fight I could find from '84 was two of what was called the Four Kings, and this was Thomas Hearns and Roberto Duran. The other two of the Four Kings being Sugar Ray Leonard and Marvin Hagler, sort of the mid '80s boxers who all ended up fighting each other. This was Bill. It was June 15th of 1984 at Caesar's Palace. Do you know what the nickname for this fight was? The tagline?
I don't actually.
The Malice at the Palace.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. So 20 years before the Malice at the Palace in Auburn Hills, this was the Malice at the Palace. I watched the whole fight yesterday. It was outside, so I couldn't help but wondering if it was constructed in the same area that WrestleMania 9 was.
Yeah, I was just about to say it was at the same place they held WrestleMania 9.
So Duran had already retired once. He comes out of retirement to face Hearns. Hearns, about 30 seconds left in the first round, Hearns knocks Duran down. Duran gets up. They give him a standing 8 count. He goes down again to end the first round and gets saved by the bell. I mean, he had gotten up, but he gets saved by the bell. And then almost immediately into round 2, Hearns flurries the punches on Duran. Duran goes down hard. They probably would have stopped the fight even if it had been his first knockdown instead of his third, just how bad it looked. And it was all over from there. Second round knockout for Thomas Hitman Hearns, who I believe is also known as the Motor City Cobra. He's got 2 very cool nicknames. And that was really the big boxing fight of 1984. If we're being honest, there was not as much there.
That would be a good. I think we've talked about this in the past. Those 4 kings of the middleweight division of the '80s. That would be a cool episode to do one time on those 4 guys. Something a little bit different than what we normally do, but that could be a cool episode to do.
Yeah, we would just have to do a lot of research because it's not something we know a ton about, other than that those guys existed and I believe all fought each other at one point or another.
I think you're right. Yeah.
So, and obviously the famous like Hagler Hearns fight is considered, even though it's like a 3-round fight, it's like the most exciting boxing match of all time. The only other one I had, so we've done auto racing, we've done horse racing, we've done boxing. We'll want to save tennis for last just because there's so much to get to with the tennis. Let's talk about golf a little bit. I just kind of wrote down who won the majors. Ben Crenshaw won the Masters. The British Open was won by Seve Ballesteros, and the PGA was won by Lee Trevino. The big one, at least from what I can tell here, was the 1984 U.S. Open, played at Winged Foot in Mamaroneck in Westchester County, which for those of you Hello Old Sports trivia fanatics, like trivia about Hello Old Sports, Mamaroneck, New York, was the last place I played an organized tackle football game my senior year of high school. We lost 21-7 on November 7th, 2003. For those of you who are keeping track of such things. The U.S. Open then as now has a 18-hole playoff the following day if the golfers are even through 72 holes. They play a full 18 holes the next day. The 2 teams that are tied, or the 2 golfers that are tied. In this case, it was Fuzzy Zeller over Greg Norman in an 18-hole playoff. Zeller had a big lead on the 4th day. Actually, Hale Irwin was the leader going into Sunday, June 17th, 1984. Irwin faded. Zeller led Norman by 3 shots heading into the back 9. Norman, who later on would go to get sort of a very famous reputation as a choke artist, he draws even with Zeller by the time they get to the 18th hole. On the 18th hole, Norman's shot goes into the grandstands, but he still manages to save par. Zeller, it says, waved the white towel as a playful sign of surrender, then proceeded to par the hole himself. They both finished at 4 under and went to a playoff the next day. The playoff the next day was Norman melted down on this playoff. He was shot a 5 over while Zeller shot a 3 under. So Zeller won by 8 shots in 18 holes, one round, Zeller beats him by 18 or by 8 strokes. So a little anticlimactic on that day, but the Sunday, certainly from what I can see here, was the most dramatic of the majors that year on the PGA Tour.
So this might now be the most I'm not that we're going to do this for 45 minutes, but this might be the most tennis we ever talk about in on this podcast. Certainly the most we've done so far in my estimation, because this is a dominant year in tennis for two of the all-time greats in tennis history, and that's John McEnroe with the men and Martina Navratilova with the women, both of whom win 3 majors. McEnroe wins the French, he wins Wimbledon, and he wins the U.S. Open. Navratilova wins the French. She also wins the French, Wimbledon, and the U.S. Open. And she had actually won the Australian the year before in 83, and then would go on to win it again in 84. Also worth noting that Navratilova also wins the doubles championship in the then this is the not mixed doubles. So this is, women against women. Martina Navratilova wins the doubles championship at all 4 majors, the Australian, the French, the Wimbledon, and U.S. Open. So again, I don't portend any great expertise towards such things, but this is, especially for Martina, maybe the most dominant single year in the history of at least of really of tennis in either gender, but definitely the most dominant year, I would have to say, in the history of women's tennis.
So the Australian Open, it's people kind of out of nowhere. So we'll just cross almost the Australian Open off. You have Mats Wilander beats Kevin Curran in the Australian Open men's final, and in the in the women, it's Chris Evert, whose name's going to come up a bunch on the earlier majors, beats Elena Sukova or something, a name similar to that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, she's been around. Yeah.
The French, Wimbledon, and U.S. So the women's, all 3 of them have the same finals, which is Martina Navratilova beating Chris Evert Lloyd at the time, or Chris Everett. Wimbledon. So McEnroe actually lost the French Open finals. He gets to the French Open finals and loses to Ivan Lendl. Then he wins Wimbledon over Jimmy Connors and wins the U.S. Open over Ivan Lendl. But so he's in 3 of them. He wins 2 of them. The finals of the French Open in '84, the men's went 3-6, 2-6. So Lendl was down the first 2 sets, and then he wins 6-4, 7-5, 7-5. So it was quite the comeback there for Ivan Lendl. But then McEnroe does win the next 2. So you're right, just a dominant. The article I read here talks about the Wimbledon, where the fans at Wimbledon, sort of then as now, but probably even more so then, were a fan of a certain type of behavior with tennis. So they'd always been lukewarm on McEnroe until this point. But he was so dominant in '84 at Wimbledon that he didn't really need to throw any tantrums. So the fans really embraced him, because they were like, well, he's behaving himself, even though it wasn't really a change. It was just that he had nothing not to behave himself about. So
I should also mention that Navratilova's doubles partner is a woman by the name of Pam Shriver, who I think I've probably heard of her at some point, who certainly doesn't have the career as that Martina Navratilova does, but wins 4 doubles, wins the doubles Grand Slam in 1984 in her own right. So she definitely is somebody who's also worth mentioning. I don't know if you had anything else really on the tennis, but I wanted to tell sort of the story of one particular day that I thought would be a good way to maybe close this out.
So just on the women's, in '83, Navratilova won the last 3 majors, and then she won the first 3. I guess in tennis they call them Grand Slams, but won the last 3, and she'd won 6 straight before she didn't win the Australian Open.
So she sort of did the Tiger Woods thing, right?
And then some.
Yeah, yeah. So she not only had all four at one point, but then she defended two of them. So
Yes.
so and I believe they just got rid of this a couple of a couple of years ago. There used to be this thing called Super Saturday at the US Open in New York. And I believe what this was it was the women's final, the men's semifinal. It was all in one day and all basically for one ticket. Let me just make sure I'm getting that right.
So that I'll let you pull that up. That sounds right because what I always remembered, the U.S. Open is 2 weeks, the end of the summer. The middle week is Labor Day, and the next week is the weekend after Labor Day, which is the first week of the NFL season. And that Sunday, when the U.S. Open for decades was on CBS wouldn't have any 4 o'clock games in week one because they had the men's championship for Wimbledon or for the U.S. Open at 4 o'clock or 4:30 that Sunday. Now they've lost. The U.S. Open's not on CBS anymore, so that's not a factor. But I think what you're saying would be right according to that.
Yeah. So I don't know how long at some point they stopped doing this. I don't know when they stopped doing it, and I can't find a definitive answer, but it used to be, yeah, it was when they moved to Queens, which they think they did sometime in the 70s, they would do men's semi, women's final, and then the other men's semi. And in this particular game, or this particular day, I should say, every match goes the distance. The men's, I guess this is the over 35 semifinal, which had been added to sort of get even more, pack even more tennis into the day. A guy by the name of Sam Smith loses the first set against a guy by the name of John Newcomb, and then wins the next two sets to win that one 2-1. Then you have the aforementioned Ivan Lendl goes up against Pat Cash, who wins that one 3-2. The great Washington Post columnist Tom Boswell, talking about Lendl, says that this match might be seen as when the Tin Man found his heart. And while Lendl ends up losing in the finals, we'll talk about that a little later. Lendl goes on to win the next 3 U.S. Opens. So it is sort of a turning point in his career. Then you get Chris Everett Lloyd against Martina Navratilova. I'm not going to, try and pretend that I understand all of the terminology here, but Navratilova, I believe she loses the first set, I believe, and then comes back and wins the second two. Let me just try and verify that, because that is pretty important, especially because the women play only the 3 sets, whereas the men play 5. So let me just make sure I have the exact. Okay, yeah. So it was a rematch of the previous year, and you said Everett had won the year before, or Martina had won the year before?
Which one are we talking about now? Which tournament?
The U.S. Open. Okay, so I'm sorry. Martina had beaten Everett 6-1, 6-3 the year before in the final. In this final, she beats her, but she actually loses the first set 4-6, and then beats her 6-4, 6-4. So comes back after losing the first set. Like we said, every match has still gone the distance. And then you get to the final of the evening, and that is John McEnroe, Billy Connors, and they each win a set 6-4 in the first 2. McEnroe wins the third set 7-5. Connors comes back and wins the fourth set. Yeah, Connors wins that set 6-4, but then McEnroe comes back to win the final set 6-3. It's a 3 hours and 45-minute match. The whole day takes over 12 hours, and every food concession had been sold out for hours at the end. And a tennis writer by the name of Peter Bodo says it was the single greatest day in tennis. And this is, I have this book. It's the 100 Greatest Days in New York Sports, which I believe I actually got for you for your birthday a couple years back as well. And there's a few tennis moments in this book, but this is one of the biggest. And this may be the single greatest day in U.S. Open history, and still gets talked about 40 years later. You know, some of the all-time greats, McEnroe, Connors, Martina Navratilova. So a great year in tennis led by two of the all-time greats. And it's sort of capped off by this great day at the U.S. Open in early September of 1984.
Yeah, certainly the big stars at the height of their sort of prowess in tennis in '84.
So I guess all that leaves us with is football. I guess I don't know how much you have on college football. There's one obviously big thing from college football, but I don't know. Do you have a rundown of sort of just what college football was in '84 that maybe you want to go through?
Well, certainly the biggest story in terms of looking like an anachronism today is that BYU won the national championship. They're the last team that's not a Power Five conference or Notre Dame to win a national championship. There was controversy about it even then because they were not a power team in terms of the conference they played in. They did have a big win over Pitt, who was highly ranked early in the year. But none of the teams in their conference that they played had less than 4 losses. They played Michigan in the Orange Bowl, I believe it was, and still did not. No, it wouldn't have been the Orange Bowl against Michigan. I have to look that up. What it was. Still did not. They beat Michigan, and Michigan was only 6-6 after that. So it wasn't like it was a powerhouse Michigan team. The team everybody points to is Washington, who went 10-1 and won the Orange Bowl against Oklahoma 28-17. And people point to them as the team that they think should have won the national championship that year. They had a lone loss to USC at the LA Coliseum 16-7 in November, but playing a major conference schedule. People, still will say that they think they got a little bit gypped out of the national championship. Doug Flutie won the Heisman Trophy. Doug Flutie from Boston College, and we have one of the more famous games in college, or moments in college football history. I did find an article from SB Nation. It was written about 6 years ago by a guy named Bill Connolly. And he talks about how 1984 is one of the wildest seasons ever because every week there were like multiple upsets. Auburn, Nebraska, Pitt, Clemson, UCLA was the top 5 going into the season. He describes it as, this honestly might have been the least accurate preseason polls ever. 7 of those 10 teams would lose at least 4 games, and 3 7-1 Pitt and 5-6 Notre Dame would finish with losing records. And it started right away where Auburn, who was the number 1 team in the country in what they call week 0, when they still had like an opening game in East Rutherford, New Jersey, at Giant Stadium. Presumably it was at Giant Stadium. I don't know where else in East Rutherford, New Jersey they would have played this game. Auburn loses. The number 1 team in the country, before the season's even really started, has lost on a neutral site to number 10 Miami. And then that following week, which is the first full week, BYU beat Pitt, who was number 3 in the country at the time, and shot BYU up the rankings, which would ultimately, put them in position. Just to go through this quickly, in week 2, Miami was number 1 now since Auburn had lost. They lost to Michigan. Meanwhile, Notre Dame, who was number 7, lost to an unranked team. The next week, number 3, Michigan loses to Washington. In week 4, number 2, Clemson loses to Georgia. Number 4, Miami loses to Florida State. So there's just, and I won't go through all these, but just every week Week 5, Nebraska's number 1 again. They lose to Syracuse. The number 1 was losing every couple of weeks, and eventually you run out of teams, and suddenly a team who was already number 1 previously became number 1 again, and then they lose again. And this just continued basically the whole year.
Yeah, and the Miami team had won, and we'll talk about this Miami team a little bit. Yeah, well, we'll get to Miami in a minute because they've got some interesting tie-ins to some other things too. But yeah, that Auburn team, that was Bo Jackson's team in '84 at Auburn that was expected to win the championship.
Yeah, so this is just a year of, and I, like I said, I stopped because it was more than I thought. But like, you could go through this every week, and there were teams in the top 5. Nebraska in week 12, for example, Nebraska's back at number 1, which I think was their 3rd time, and they lose to Oklahoma 17-7. Number 2 is South Carolina. They lose by 17 to Navy. Jeez. So the number 1 and number 2 teams both lose. And it's just this was every week, basically, in the '84 college football season.
So obviously the most famous moment is the Boston College upset of Miami, November 23rd, 1984. This game is at the Orange Bowl in Miami. Miami is led quarterback by Bernie Kosar. And this is a Miami team that had won the national championship the year before. And you know who the coach is of this Miami team?
In '84?
Yeah.
What's his name had left by then?
It was Jimmy Johnson. This is Jimmy Johnson's
Johnson was
first...
the coach by '84.
This is Johnson's first year. The year before in '83, and this is a guy we actually talked about, I think it was 2020 in the In Memoriam, Howard Schnellenberger had been the coach in '83 and had left Miami after winning the national championship the year before. And I think he went to the USFL, you said, right?
It was this whole convoluted thing where I know the Giants had talked to him.
Yeah, the Giants talked to him about maybe trying to replace Parcells after Parcells' 1 year.
So he was the head coach of University of Miami as they were on the verge of dropping the program. He gets them to win the national championship. He fends off offers from the NFL. And then for whatever reason, he decides he's going to coach he's going to become part owner, president, and GM of the Spirit of Miami, of the USFL, which is going to be the Washington Federals are going to relocate to Miami. That August of '83, I guess August of '84, somebody in the USFL office has the brilliant idea that they want to move the USFL to the fall.
And I would just let me just interject here too. We were going to get into the USFL a little bit, but we also did a whole episode on expansion football leagues and rival leagues and stuff. So we probably won't delve too much into the USFL and all of the crazy characters. But anyway, go ahead.
So basically Howard Schnellenberger's like, I didn't sign up for this. I don't want to compete against the Dolphins in the fall in Miami when the Dolphins were still, we're going to talk about the Dolphins in a minute. So he's like, never mind, I'm not doing this. And ultimately ends up at Louisville by 1985. So he just kind of gets where it's funny to think that the guy played his way from potentially taking over the New York Giants. And who knows in what way history is different, but it was a Giants team that had the talent on it that 3 years later they won the Super Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
Ends up in a weird squeeze play with the USFL and ends up at Louisville. Like really, or could have stayed at Miami and, probably continued to win national championships, the University of Miami. So just a real catastrophic turn of events from a business standpoint for Howard Schnellenberger there.
So just real quick on this famous game, because you still hear about this. 28 seconds left. Kosar leads Miami to a 45-41 lead. Flutie manages to move BC 32 yards in 3 plays. There are 6 seconds on the clock. He calls for a Hail Mary. He takes a snap. He's sort of flushed out of the pocket. He's looking for Gerard Phelan, who I believe, in addition to being the guy who catches this pass, Phelan, I think, is also Flutie's roommate. I'm not 100% sure about that, but Phelan comes down with the ball. It's considered one of the great moments in football history, college football history. When you talk about all of the great moments in the history of Boston sports, in all of, whether it's Bobby Orr or, Larry Bird's steal, or, '04 Red Sox, Brady, all these things. That's like the one college sports, especially college football moment that gets thrown in there. And it's probably also the most memorable moment of Doug Flutie's football career, because he's in the NFL for a couple of years, then he's in Canada, then he's back in the NFL for, sort of the twilight of his career, and then he ends up sticking around for a really long time. He's with the Patriots in like 2006 or something like that. But
he drop kicked. He did it. 2006.
He drop kicked a conversion. It was the first time it had been done since like 1943. So, yeah. So Flutie, whose NFL career is sort of very weird, but he was a Heisman Trophy winner and a hero at Boston College in 1984. So you'd hear all this talk, growing up about Flutie, and I would always be like, you mean this little guy who plays in Canada? Who cares? But if you understand a little bit more about who he was in 1984, you maybe understand the media fascination with him in years future.
And it was a fleeting moment, but he did become that sort of media fascination again, those couple of good years he had in Buffalo.
Yeah. Until what was that coach that benched him?
Wade Phillips,
yeah. Benched him.
So just to close the loop on the 84 college season. So by the way, Army beat Navy 24-11. That might have been I think 83 was the one I think that was at the Rose Bowl in California.
Mm-hmm. We did an episode on Army Navy football history, one of our very first episodes. So check that one out too.
It's kind of a weird confluence of different things. And this is where you want to point out that, like, yeah, the current system and the system that's going to be a new system this year, and even the BCS had its flaws. But when you look at the way that things used to be, when teams were tied into bowl games, but also if you weren't you could have been number 2 in the country, but if your one loss was to a league team and you didn't end up winning your division, you weren't going to be in the biggest bowl. So the 2 bowls that factored into the national championship, you had number 1 BYU playing a 6-5 Michigan team in the Holiday Bowl. And the reason it says, as WAC champion, BYU was obligated to play in the Holiday Bowl against 6-5 Michigan. Granted, Michigan was pretty good. They were a top 15 team, whatever. Michigan ends up winning the game. Michigan actually had a 17-10 lead, but BYU comes back. They win 24-17. The other game of interest is the Orange Bowl, and the Orange Bowl is going to be between Washington and Oklahoma. Now, Washington, being the number 4 team in the country and 1 loss, you would think as a Pac-10 team, or maybe Pac-8 at that point, would be playing in the Rose Bowl. But because their loss to USC knocked the Huskies out of the Rose Bowl, instead of playing number 6 Ohio State, they get a chance at the number 2 team in the country and a chance to potentially beat them and win the national championship. So that's how backwards all this is. So if Oklahoma wins, they probably end up passing BYU in the rankings. But instead, Washington beats them late. They win 28-17. They got a couple of late scores. It was 17-14. Like, the game was still in doubt late, and then Washington scored a couple of times late. So they win. Washington jumps from 4-2, but they decide they're not going to have them jump BYU, where if Oklahoma had won, they probably would have jumped BYU. The interesting thing on this SB Nation article said if there'd been a playoff in 1984 and it didn't ignore mid-majors like the current one does, we'd have gotten something like number 1 Oklahoma versus number 4 Ohio State and number 2 Washington versus number 3 BYU. The Huskies came up 20 points short in the final AP poll, and BYU scored a national title that people would continue to resent years later.
So before we leave college football, I just have to mention Boston University Terriers, 9-3, co-champions of the Division I AA Yankee Conference, co-champions along with Rhode Island. They actually opened up the season on September 8th at Yankee Stadium against Grambling State, which I believe was that Eddie Robinson's team, the guy who was there. Yeah. He was there for
Grambling State became Grambling, or the other way around, but it's the same school.
Yeah. And this is that Whitney Young Memorial Classic that they played at Yankee Stadium for forever. How BU got involved in it, I have no idea, because I think it was usually for historically black colleges, but whatever. BU opens up the season 5-0 with victories over Grambling State, Morgan State, New Hampshire, Maine, and Delaware. And then they lose 2, win their next 4, and then in the first round of the Division I AA playoffs, they lose a heartbreaker 35-33 against the Richmond Spiders. And so and then they're the guy by the name of Rick Taylor, who I believe is the winningest coach in BU football history, retires after the 1984 season, and it's sort of downhill for BU after that. They go 3-8, followed by 4-7, followed by 3-8, 4-7, 4-7, 5-6, 4-7, 3-8. Ooh, 12-1 in 1993. I don't know what happened to that. Maybe it was the fact that they brought in Tony Sperano as the offensive coordinator, which I did not know. They actually have a couple good years, 9-3 in 94. 3-8 again in 95, and then I believe 1-10 in 96, and then 97 is 1-10 when they disband the team. So 84, one of the last great seasons in the history of Boston University football.
A great college football. They do every sport, but college football is their bread and butter. Twitter account, blog, whatever. It's called the Sickos Committee, and they have a thing here. They were a running thing they were doing for a while in the off season. I guess it's still the off season. The best season of all time for schools who stopped having a football team, aka the BSOAT, and they abbreviate it. And one of them was the Boston University Terriers. It looks like it's paywalled. I read it at one point, but it looks like they're talking about that 93 team that only lost 1 game, but they did cover BU. They're two running things like that. Is that best season of all time for a team that doesn't have football anymore, and the other one is the worst season of all time of like a historically great program. So those are kind of fun. Themes. And when I saw BU, I was like, oh, I should definitely take a look at this.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. So I don't know how much. Do we have anything else on college, or do we want to move into? I guess we can touch on the USFL real quick, even though we sort of. I said, we really kind of got into the USFL as far as just the story of the league. We got into that a lot when we did an episode about, I think it was 2 years ago, but I don't know, maybe I think Jim Kelly is the MVP of the USFL this year, having been drafted by Buffalo, but opting to go play for the New York, New Jersey team. I don't know what else there really is as far as like the on the field or anything with the USFL in 84. It's their second of 3 years. It's their last, as you mentioned, it's their last spring season.
Yeah, so the next year they would play in the fall, and then that would be it. Rule changes, these are not important. The teams played preseason games, and they added a side judge to make a 7-man crew. Teams that were sold, the New Jersey Generals, the Denver Gold, the USFL took control of the Chicago Blitz. Anytime you start hearing that, the league's on its last legs when the teams when it happens more than once at a time, I think you have to say. Players voted to form a union. Philadelphia and Tampa Bay played in the postseason exhibition game billed as the Jet Save Challenge Cup in Wembley Stadium on July 21st. On August 22nd, owners voted to move to a fall schedule. The teams, the Philadelphia Stars went 16-2, the New Jersey Generals 14-4 in the Southern Division. The Birmingham Stallions went 14-4, as did the Tampa Bay Bandits. And then there was others. Well, there was a lot more teams than I thought. The Pacific Division, Los Angeles and Arizona, and in the Central, the Houston Gamblers and Michigan Panthers were your eight playoff teams in the USFL in 1984.
All right, and I guess we should close with the NFL, right?
Yeah, I guess I'll say ultimately Philadelphia beat Arizona in the USFL championship game. You know who the head coach of the Philadelphia team was?
You know, I was just looking at this a minute ago with the list of coaches. I don't know if I still have it in front of me. It was Jim Mora.
Yes, and the coach of the Arizona team was George Allen.
Oh, that's right. George Allen went there. There's some interesting coaches here. Marv Levy coaches the Chicago team. Jack Pardee, who was he had been the coach of the Oilers in the late 70s. Jack Pardee, right?
I think I could have. He went back to. He was the Oilers coach in the 90s.
He was the Oilers coach in the 90s. He was the Oilers head coach when Buddy Ryan and Kevin Gilbride got into it on the slide. Then, he later coached the. He had previously coached the Redskins, among other places. Yeah. Craig Morton, the former pro quarterback, is a coach here. Steve Spurrier. So yeah, there's some interesting guys. Walt Michaels, who I think who had previously coached the Jets in the 70s and 80s. So yeah, it's interesting guys as coaches in the USFL.
So that turns our attention, I guess, to the NFL.
Yeah, and I guess really one of the biggest things here is that you have some really great you have some rushing marks that are set here. First of all, on the single season front, Eric Dickerson becomes, I think it's only he's only the second guy. There's only 8 players in history who've run for 2,000 yards. And ironically, despite everything you hear about how it's so much more of a passing game, several of 4 of those guys are in the 21st century, and the most recent is Derrick Henry, who did it in 2020 with 2,027 yards. But Eric Dickerson sets the single season rushing record, a record that still stands in his second year as a pro. He had been rookie of the year before. He's with the Los Angeles Rams, and he runs for 2,105 yards on 379 carries. That is the most rushing yards in a single season by any player in NFL history. Second is actually Adrian Peterson in 2012 with 2,097, and he does it for this 1984 Ram team, which is a decent enough team. The Rams lose to the Giants in the wild card round in 1984, but one of the great single season rushing performances of all time by Eric Dickerson with 2,105 yards.
Kind of the thing I feel like we have to mention, to go backwards a little bit. Before the season started, the big news in the NFL in March of that year was the famous Colts moving from Baltimore to Indianapolis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the whole midnight.
Yeah. We'll skip all the details on it. Basically, it's kind of the usual story of they wanted a new stadium. They wanted the public to pay for the stadium. City of Baltimore, state of Maryland is saying they're not going to do that. They don't have the money. It would have to be privately paid. All the while, the owner, although there was some color to this earlier where he was like, he was coming off the plane and he was drunk, but basically Irsay gets permission to negotiate with Phoenix and Indianapolis to potentially move the team. On March 27th, 1984, the Maryland Senate passed legislation giving the city of Baltimore the right to seize ownership of the Colts by eminent domain, which was an idea first floated in a memo written by a Baltimore mayoral aide named Mark Wasserman. Irsay said the move to Indianapolis was a direct result of the eminent domain bill. They not only threw down the gauntlet, but they put a gun to my head and cocked it and asked, "Want to see if it's loaded?" According to him, he felt this was the move. This meant he needed to move in the way he moved, which was overnight. The famous Mayflower trucks. I've always wondered if that like hurt Mayflower's business in Baltimore. You would have to imagine it did.
You would think so, yeah.
Basically, the people in the city of Baltimore woke up one day and found out that the Colts were gone. They were to Indianapolis. It just talks about after that, Baltimore city officials got serious about keeping the Orioles, and that was what led to Camden Yards. There was all kinds of lawsuits, and eventually the settlement of it was, in addition, like basically in return for the city of Baltimore and the state of Maryland dropping all their lawsuits against Jim Irsay, he would advocate for them to get a new team in Baltimore, which ended up being the Cleveland Browns.
Yeah, and there's those famous video of it's in like not a blizzard, but like sort of like a what day was it that you said that it happened? It was like March, right?
It's like late March, yeah.
Yeah, so there's like a March snow, like one of those. It's snowing, but it's not like a snowstorm. It's not sticking on the roads, but it's just like a gray March northeast day, and it's just these trucks leaving Maryland, and it's kind of like a requiem for the Baltimore Colts. Did you have anything else on sort of the off season? Because I wanted to get a little bit into Walter Payton also.
So the draft is not a particularly famous one. Irving Fryer is the number one overall pick by New England. Would go on to end up having a very, very good career, not necessarily in New England after he overcame some of his personal issues. I think his best years were with Miami. The Giants picked Carl Banks, third overall, who went on to be a perennial Pro Bowler. Some other names that kind of stand out here. Boomer Esiason is picked 38th overall. He's the first quarterback taken by. He goes to Cincinnati and ultimately wins an MVP, gets them to a Super Bowl.
And that's
Jeff Hostetler, the Giants take him in the third round, but
and that's
no like Hall of Famers.
And that's a contrast because the year before there'd been 5 quarterbacks taken in the first round, including Elway, Kelly, Marino, all these guys.
Yeah.
And this year you don't get one drafted until several picks into the second round.
Yep. And then I don't think this was a year where there was a lot of significant rule changes or anything. The league's jersey numbering system was modified to allow linebackers to wear numbers 90 to 99. Kicker or holder who fakes being roughed or run into can receive an unsportsmanlike conduct penalty. And they put in the prolonged, excessive, or premeditated celebration rule for unsportsmanlike conduct, referred to as the Mark Gastineau rule. So, but no major changes to the game or the structure of the league or anything like that.
Walter Payton breaks Jim Brown's all-time rushing yard record, and I believe Peyton still has that record, if I'm not mistaken. Nobody's broken that, have they?
All-time rushing yards?
Yeah.
Emmitt Smith.
Did he?
Yeah.
Is that really obvious and I should know it?
I mean, he did it, he did it with Arizona, but Peyton is still second. You actually, who third is?
Yeah, I just pulled up Frank Gore.
Frank Gore. Yeah. And I mean, he's only, I guess you could say he's only 700 yards, but at first I thought it was only 26 yards. I was like, he really didn't hang on to pass Peyton, but he was 726 yards. But Emmitt Smith has it.
Frank Gore is going to the Hall of Fame. It's crazy to think about. Never thought of him as an elite running back, but he's probably a first ballot Hall of Famer. So yeah, Walt, as the 1984 season dawns, Walter Payton is sort of gradually inching up on the record held by Jim Brown. It's interesting though. He breaks it against the Saints, On the second play of the second half with a 6-yard rush. Peyton would go on to play, I believe it's 3 more seasons in the NFL after this. I believe he retires after the 1987 season. Walter Payton does. Jim Brown, you've heard the story, I assume, about how Jim Brown was not happy about somebody breaking his record, that he actually threatened that he was going to come out of retirement at, I think he was 48 at this point, and he was threatening that he was going to come out of retirement to prevent Walter Payton from breaking his record. Have you heard that story?
I'm sure I've heard it at some point. I can't say I remember it. I also can't say it's remotely surprising. But yeah, so, and by the way, I looked, Peyton's last year was 87.
So one of the things that I didn't realize, and this is, let me just see so Jim Brown's all-time total was 12,312. So that's the number that gets broken by Peyton in 1984. I think that I just read this when I was prepping for this episode. Apparently, Jim Brown's issue is not so much with Peyton as it is with Franco Harris. And Franco Harris going into the 84 season also had a chance to break the record. Harris, and we talked about this in our Steelers Dark Years episode, Harris going into this season has 11,950 or something. So he's, and I think that's probably about what Peyton has too. Now, Harris, who'd been cut by the Steelers, he'd signed with the Seattle Seahawks. I think that what Jim Brown really didn't like was this idea that Franco Harris was just going to kind of limp through on a new team, a bad team, and he is sort of a broken down player. So the objection, and I shouldn't say it was a bad team actually, because they ended up going 12-4, but I shouldn't necessarily call them so I think that was sort of more the issue that Brown had, was more with Franco Harris than with Walter Payton. And I never realized until I was doing the research for this episode just how close Franco Harris came to breaking Jim Brown's record. Now, he ended up petering out, whereas Walter Payton didn't. But going into the 84 season, there's actually 2 guys chasing this record. There's both Walter Payton and Franco Harris.
I did not know that either. I had no idea.
All right, so maybe we want to just kind of talk about the big teams here. Just kind of a little bit of a rundown of the 84 playoffs, and then a Super Bowl between 2 of the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history.
Yeah, so just real quick on the standings, you end up with your division winners are Miami at 14-2, Pittsburgh at 9-7 wins their division, Denver wins it at 13-3. We're in the era of 2 wild cards, so both wild cards also come from that AFC West. Those Seattle Seahawks you mentioned are 12-4, and the LA Raiders are 11-5. Sort of on the bottom of the league, you got those Indianapolis Colts 4-12, Buffalo 2-14, Houston 3-13. In the NFC East, Washington wins the division 11-5. The Giants make a wild card at 9-7. There's actually a 3-way tie in that division at 9-7 between the Giants, the Cardinals, and the Cowboys, which the Giants win on tiebreakers. The Bears win their division at 10-6. The 49ers are 15-1. They win their division, and then the Rams with Eric Dickerson are the number 4 seed. So the wild card game is the Giants at the Rams in Los Angeles, I guess in Anaheim technically, but Los Angeles area.
So this is Dan Marino's only MVP season as an NFL quarterback. He's in his 2nd season with the Dolphins. The ironic thing here is that if you look at the team that he joins, which is Don Shula's Dolphins team, they had been to the Super Bowl just 2 years previously with David Woodley at quarterback, who was sort of a journeyman at best, David Woodley, with a team that was sort of really focused on a running attack. And then if you go back even further to the 70s on those great, the undefeated team and the team of the year after, those teams had been so running oriented. They'd have games where they wouldn't even throw double-digit passes, and they had a Hall of Fame quarterback in Bob Greasy. But Shula, well into his second decade as the Dolphins coach, really kind of changes his ways after they draft Dan Marino. And in this 84 season, Marino breaks six NFL full season passing records, including the records for most touchdown passes with 48 and most passing yards with 5,084. Wins MVP with the 14-2 record. They're the number one seed, and they I don't know if you'd say they sort of blazed through the playoffs, but they beat Seattle 31-10. They beat Pittsburgh 45-28. They're really putting it up numbers. And everybody thinks this is going to be the first of many Super Bowl appearances for Dan Marino, but it ends up being his only one. And it's really a disappointing loss. And the team that they lose to is probably one of the greatest. We talked about the 84 Tigers as one of the greatest single season teams in MLB history. This 84 49ers team is one of the greatest single season teams in the history of the National Football League.
Yeah, and I think so. The Dolphins in 84 went 14-2. And just to go through the AFC playoffs real quick, Seattle wins 13-7 in the wild card. Pittsburgh goes on the road and beats Denver. Miami beats Seattle 31-10, and then the AFC Championship game, it's Miami 45, Pittsburgh 28. The 49ers, and I'll do the NFC playoffs in a second. I think when people go like shorthand with the really good 49ers teams, and I'm guilty of this too, I kind of go right to the 89 team because they beat, they were so good. I think they were 14-2 that year.
Yeah.
They destroyed the Broncos in the Super Bowl 55-10. It's the team that's got Rice on it, and it's a lot of the guys that you associate with those late 80s teams. And then obviously 81 is famous because of the catch. But this 84 team really was the best of all of those teams. It's weird because it's kind of on an island. They won in 81. They didn't win again until 84, and then they didn't win again after that till 88. But in 84, they're 15-1. Their only loss is to Pittsburgh. And I was trying to figure out why I'm like, we've talked about that before. It's because when we did the Dark Ages Steelers, we talked about the 84 Steelers a little bit.
Niners leading this game 17-10. And then Pittsburgh comes back, gets a touchdown from John Stallworth, the future Hall of Fame receiver, and then a game-winning field goal from Gary Anderson, who should probably be a Hall of Fame kicker. And that's their only loss. They were Gary Anderson field goal away from an undefeated season in 1984.
They're the first team to win 15 regular season games since the NFL expanded to 16 games. And I think 1978 was the year they did that. So in the playoffs, the Giants beat the Rams on the road in the wild card round. Giants play San Francisco the next week in the divisional round. San Francisco wins 21-10. Montana throws for 309 yards and 3 touchdowns. They really, 21-10 it was 21-10 at half. There's no scoring in that game in the second half, actually, but really a dominant performance by the 49ers, even if it didn't have a really crooked score. The next day, Chicago beats Washington on the road in a bit of an upset at RFK, 23-19. And then in the NFC Championship game, the 49ers just hammer the Bears. And remember, this is a team that's about to, it sounds silly to say, but this is a team that's about to become the 85 Bears. And the 49ers destroyed them in the playoffs, 23-0. They get the Bears only go for 186 yards. This is probably the best defense of these 49ers teams, this 84 team. And they end up winning 23-0 and sets the stage for a Super Bowl with Joe Montana, Dan Marino. Both teams won 14 and 15 games respectively in this season, and sort of a Clash of the Titans-esque Super Bowl, at least up until the game started.
Yeah, and this is probably also the most and the 49ers were always well known for having very balanced offensive attacks. But this is Joe Montana throws touchdown passes in this season to 10 different receivers. The leading receiver is Dwight Clark, who is, Montana's roommate and good friend, who has 880 yards. They actually get a really good rushing season from a guy named Wendell Tyler, who has spent the first half of his career with the LA Rams. This is actually his only Super Bowl victory, or only appearance in the Super Bowl. He comes to the 49ers before the 83 season. In 84, he makes his only Pro Bowl, runs for 1,262 yards and 7 touchdowns, helps lead the 49ers into the playoffs, and then he's out of the league by 1986. So this, like you said, they got a good defense. They got a really, really balanced attack on offense. Montana is 28. He's in his prime. He's a Pro Bowler for the third time in 4 years, third time in his career. And so you can understand why everybody thought this would be a battle of the Titans, but the real sort of, at the end of the day, the 49ers really just sort of smack them, I should say. A lot of that, from what I was able to research, was that some of that was due to the defensive game plan of the 49ers and one George Seifert, the defensive coordinator, who decides to switch his team to a nickel defense. Super Bowl 19 is played at Stanford. It's one of these Super Bowls that is was there an issue with why this was played here and not in an NFL stadium, or did it just, because I can't imagine they would have chosen a college stadium right off.
I'm looking here. It says NFL owners voted to award Super Bowl 19 to Stanford Stadium on December 14th, 1982. At the owners' midseason, blah, blah, blah. It became the fourth primarily collegiate stadium to host a Super Bowl, following Tulane Stadium, Rice Stadium, and the Rose Bowl. Owners had tentatively planned, each made presentations, with only Detroit and Dallas expressly bidding on only 19. Tampa was selected, but with no outstanding options. They postponed it. A total of 10 cities put in bids. Stanford Stadium was picked despite having no lights at the time, no dressing room, and a substandard press box. So interesting. I guess they made those upgrades or didn't make those upgrades. But yeah, so that was the decision-making process. I guess it was a lack of options. And I guess when you think back then, there was only so many cities they were going to put it in for a long time. If you go back to the mid-'80s, they're not going to do it anywhere that's cold. They would do it in a dome. They did it in Detroit, although I think they got enough of that in that year to not do it in Detroit again for a really long time. So what does that leave? That leaves Miami, who was still playing in the Orange Bowl at that point, which was becoming a little outdated. New Orleans at the Superdome. They never did one at Texas Stadium, to the best of my knowledge.
No. LA.
San Diego, I know. Yeah, LA, Tampa. There's not as many, there wasn't as many to choose from as it seemed like. So
yeah, you kind of got the feeling for a while, let me just pull up the locations real quick, that they kind of just moved back and forth between LA, Florida, and Tampa, New Orleans, rather, I should say, for sort of, so like LA, Miami, New Orleans, Miami, New Orleans, LA, Houston. They did one at Rice that you mentioned, Super Bowl 7, but then New Orleans, Miami, Pasadena, which is not that far from LA, New Orleans, Miami, Pasadena, New Orleans, the Pontiac, Michigan in 16, and then Pasadena, Tampa the year before, and then Stanford, New Orleans, Pasadena. So, and then really like, until Minnesota at the Metrodome in 26, they really don't mix it up. And I guess you could say 10 years previous in Detroit, they don't really mix it up in any meaningful way for a very long time. Like, they're not thinking about Indianapolis at this point. They're not thinking about
Atlanta.
They're not thinking about, or Arizona. I guess they did one. No, they don't do any in Arizona. They're not thinking about a lot of these places. So yeah, you're right.
Astrodome.
They never did it at the Astrodome, did they?
I don't think so.
I don't think they did. Yeah. So
they've done it in Houston since whatever NRG Stadium.
NRG, yeah. So but so it's not as strange when you think about it in that context that's what it ended up being.
So the Dolphins are actually up 10-7 at the end of the first quarter. 49ers, like I think you mentioned here, they switched to a 4-1-6 defense attack.
Okay.
So they went to an unconventional defensive alignment. The Dolphins saw that and decided to run, which I'm sure the 49ers would have been happy with to begin with, but also the running game really didn't get established. They end up having to punt from deep in their own territory. The 49ers, Montana hits Craig to make it 14-10. They would stay in front from there. By halftime, they're up. Jesus, what are they up by halftime? 28-10?
28-16.
28-16. Okay, the Dolphins got a couple of field goals late. So
the Dolphins got a couple of field goals from Yu Von Schaman, who has one of the greatest names in NFL history.
So they got a field goal to make it 28-13 with 12 seconds left in the half. 49ers botched the ensuing kickoff, and they got another field goal out of it. So they got 2 field goals in the last 12 seconds and a half to make it 28-16. The quote from Guy McIntyre, who's the one who mishandled the onside kick, said, "I can laugh about the play now, but it wasn't funny at the time. My first instinct when I got the ball was to fall down, but I heard everyone yelling, 'Get up, get up.' So I got up, and there comes someone sneaking underneath me to hit the ball." First defensive play of the second half, Dwayne Board tackled Nathan on the Dolphins for a 1-yard loss. Board sacks Marino on third down. They punt it, and the 49ers get to a field goal, 31-16, and really it's academic from there. San Francisco ends up with 537 yards of offense, breaks the Super Bowl record set by the Raiders by more than 100 yards. The Dolphins ran for just 25 yards. Marino, 29-50 for 318 yards, a touchdown and 2 interceptions. So, good, but certainly not. The 2 interceptions were damaging to them. Montana was, I don't see Montana's number here. Let me pull this up here. Player stats. Montana was 24 of 35 for 331 yards and 3 touchdowns. So, and also ran for 59 yards.
And a touchdown. Well. He scored a rushing touchdown, too.
In the game, yeah. Second leading rusher on the Niners behind Wendell Tyler. And they marched to their second title in 4 years, a dominant all-time season, 18-1. They really were not challenged in the playoffs at all. And people talk a lot about the team the next year, the 85 Bears. I mean, this 84 49ers team nearly dominant, and, nearly as dominant in every way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That Bears team, I think, there's just so many reasons why I think that Bears team gets put up in memory for what it is. I think the fact that they have so many Hall of Fame defenders and Buddy Ryan, the fact that they just annihilated the Patriots in the Super Bowl. Do you remember the story? And I don't know, I'm kind of really going off on a tangent here, but do you remember the story a couple of years ago about the 2 prep schools that played on ESPN, the football game?
And the one didn't actually exist.
The one didn't actually exist, and they just got totally just embarrassed, just physically manhandled. That's kind of what that Patriots Bears Super Bowl was like in '85. I kind of feel like if instead of 46-10, that game had been 28-10 or 46-28, that maybe we wouldn't remember the Bears that dominant, but they just embarrassed the Patriots team in the Super Bowl that I think that kind of put a capper on it. But you're right. I mean, both teams were 15-1. The Dolphins beat the Bears by more in '85 than the Steelers beat the Niners by in '84. So, and obviously, if you're talking offenses, it's no question. Walter Payton notwithstanding. So, yeah, you might be right. I mean, there probably are just as good. So I would tend to agree. Couple things I would note about the two quarterbacks. This win is especially meaningful for Joe Montana because he had really in the days and weeks leading up to the game, he was really getting tired of the Marino comparisons because he felt that he had been there for years, had won a title, and that maybe he was not getting the respect that he deserved as compared to Dan Marino. The other thing is, and I wasn't able to find this story anywhere specifically, but I'd heard it in the past that kind of after this game, Dan Marino, who's in his early 20s still and is, just had this dominant MVP season, and they made the Super Bowl in his second year. He's kind of, in the aftermath of the game, he's saying, well, we lost this, but we'll be back. I'll be back in the Super Bowl. And he plays on some good teams. He puts up some good numbers. He's a Hall of Famer, but I think 15 more years in the NFL, Dan Marino never makes it back to the Super Bowl. This is as close as the man ever comes to a world championship, and it's in only his second year in the league. Jim Kelly gets back. Boomer Esiason gets back. A lot of these quarterbacks, Elway obviously makes it to 5 Super Bowls, and Elway and Kelly were guys who were drafted in that same draft as Marino, but Marino, who statistically and talent-wise is probably the best of the bunch, never even gets back to another Super Bowl.
Yeah, they're in the AFC Championship game the next year where they're upset by those Patriots, and then they're back in 92. They lose to the Bills. The Bills on their way to their third straight of 4 Super Bowls, and they're actually at home again in that game. I forgot they were at home in that game. They get their butts kicked at home, 29-10 in that game. So, they're perennially a playoff team, but they get to a couple conference championship games. They're beaten pretty soundly in both of those, and Dan Marino forever becomes another guy that fairly or unfairly gets reduced to, well, he never won a championship.
Yeah, and when you talk about a quarterback, I never think that's entirely unfair. I mean, people want to say that about like a second baseman or something. I can understand why that's a little unfair, but most of the all-time great quarterbacks have won titles. Peyton Manning won a couple titles. Obviously Brady, Montana, Favre. Favre would not be considered one of the all-time 10 to 12 greats if he hadn't won a Super Bowl. He only won one, but he won a Super Bowl. So I don't think it's wrong to ding Dan Marino, not only for not winning one, but for never getting back to one the last 15 years of his career. That to me is not a wrong criticism of Dan Marino.
No, there's some. He's probably the one that it's most fair to ding for it. Where it goes too far is people saying like, well, I'd take Trent Dilfer's career over Dan Marino's. And it's like, well, I mean, sure, if you're only talking about winning a Super Bowl, then I would take the backup quarterback on the 70 Steelers, who probably won a few. That doesn't make him a better quarterback than Dan Marino.
Yeah, and at a certain point, it's like it's longevity versus a single year. Yeah, maybe you'd rather have Trent Dilfer's Super Bowl performance than Dan Marino's, but then if you're going to say that, then you'd rather have Doug Williams than any of them for his one. So you're right. It's a balancing act and it can go too far, but I do think it's a fair criticism. So
decent point. Yeah.
A lot of, a lot of interesting stuff in 84. I think definitely, I don't want to undersell this episode because that's the one that you're currently listening to. If you had to pick one story from 84, it would definitely be Lakers Celtics. And then, you get into some of the Olympic stuff and everything else. And, the tennis is a big story, but it's, there's some really interesting stuff going on, whether it's the Cubs or the Dolphins, teams that wouldn't necessarily, the Padres, teams that wouldn't necessarily be back in future years. So it's it was fun to go back and relive, the year 1984 in sports, 4 decades after the fact.
And the birth of Hulkamania.
Indeed. And Hulkamania was born in cold day in January. It was January of '84 when he beat the Sheik, right?
Yep.
I was
January
actually
23rd, 1984.
I was actually just watching that MSG House show on Peacock a couple weeks ago. The rest of it, oh boy, it's some interesting.
Yeah.
I actually think one of the guys on the card was the guy who killed Bruiser Brody.
Oh, yeah. The invaders were there.
Yeah,
Right. Was that what they were? Yep. The invader. Yep.
So anyway, interesting way to close things out. But we hope you all enjoyed it. It was a fun dive. We always enjoy doing this because it's a good way to mix sort of things we might otherwise talk about a lot and then things we might otherwise not talk about so much. So lots of fun.
Yeah, I enjoyed it as well, and splitting it into two parts, recording wise, was certainly the right move for us.
Yeah, we got smart this time. We didn't even pretend that we were going to do them all in one episode. So, all right. Well, we'll be back, in a couple of weeks with something else. But we hope you enjoyed this. We hope you enjoyed the last episode. If you haven't listened to it, go back and give it a listen. And we are rapidly approaching 100 episodes. So, and they're all evergreen. So it's not like if you have listened to all the newer episodes and you want to go back to listen to something from 3 years ago, you should feel free to go for it. But until then, we'll be back with new content soon. And I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, old sports.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude. And I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.